I will start letting everybody in now.
All right, good evening, everyone. As you all come on into our webinar, we want to welcome you to this month's American Promise Connect call. I am Dr. Jessica Hare, Vice President of Outreach here at American Promise. And before we dive into this phenomenal call with a phenomenal panel that we have tonight, I would definitely like to take a minute to acknowledge the horrific events that have happened yesterday in Texas and also in our country. Our thoughts, our prayers are with the families, the school staff, and everyone that is in Texas and other places around our country. We at American Promise, we want to make sure that we acknowledge that I have small children. I have elementary school children and a middle school daughter. And, I think it's imperative that right now we talk to our children about what's happening, make sure that they are okay physically and mentally, as well as ourselves. And so before I go into our call, I want to make sure that everyone has an important resource, psychologytoday.com, where you can find a therapist or someone in your area that you can talk to about the events that are happening, and also get help for your children if they need someone to talk to as well. I think that is very important. As you all know, my background is in social work. And so this is like very dear to my heart, again, as I have small children as well. And I had the conversation with them last night about what happened. And it just took everything in me not to break down and crying, because, we send our children to school and we don't think that they, are in harm's way whenever we send them away from us. So please, please, please acknowledge your feelings, acknowledge everything that is happening in your mind, in your children's mind. The resource is psychologytoday.com to make sure that, you reach out and seek help if needed. So with that being said, again, good evening and welcome to tonight's American Promise Connect call. As you all know, this is a monthly national call to educate a diverse audience on American Promise's mission, expand our reach with new partners, and share how you all can get involved. And each month we have different guests. And tonight we have teamed up with Danielle Allen, co-chair of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission, on the practice democratic citizenship on our common purpose, reinventing democracy for the 21st century. We have Ms. Diane Aviv, CEO of Partnership for American Democracy and former CEO of Feeding America, and Ms. Diane Hessan, an award-winning entrepreneur, innovator in the market research field, and author of the book, Our Common Ground, Insights from 4 Years Listening to American Voters. So tonight we will share progress of the nonpartisan Our Common Purpose Commission's recommendations to save American democracy, hear about the inspiring plans for the powerful cross-sector Partisanship for American Democracy group just after its launch event, Elections, A More Perfect Union, and get an insider look at Our Common Ground, a new book that is exploring why Trump voters and Biden voters have more in common than we may think, and how we can build on that common ground for transformation. So before I turn it over to our president, Jeff Clements, I'd definitely like to thank our co-sponsors, Partnership for American Democracy and American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So again, welcome to this month's American Promise Connect call. You all are in for a treat. We have some dynamic speakers. And with that being said, I will turn it over to Jeff Clements, our president here at American Promise.
Hey, thank you so much, Dr. Jessica. Hello, everybody. I'm really glad to be here with you. Glad to have you here with us and looking forward to our conversation tonight. I'm glad to have this conversation, although I appreciate that Dr. Jessica acknowledged and spoke to how raw this moment is. I think in a lot of ways, America is brokenhearted right now and angry and sad. We keep going through this and it's getting worse and worse. And of course, it's the guns, but of course it's mental health. Of course, it's the same cycles of performative politics, and nothing seems to get done. And it is becoming clear, I think, to so many Americans, what has been clear to many of us, that the banging and pulling the levers of the current system and the current civic fabric are not going to fix that or the many, many other crises that have been bearing down on us these past years. And we have to write a new story. We have to build a new. It is that grave position that this will not fix itself, and the current political system will not be responsive unless we, the people, literally begin building a new system. I was saying to the folks who we're about to bring into the call, our special guests tonight, before, I think a lot of us in America right now are kind of fed up and just saying what we mean. And I hope we always do that. But tonight, I just have to say, it has felt like this for some time, but it seems very clear we're in a struggle, an epic struggle of darkness, really forces of darkness against forces of light. And if you're on this call tonight, you're among the forces of light. So there really are forces of light, and we really are in a struggle. So we have to identify and connect with each other who are fighting and working for the forces of light, because the forces of darkness will gather and get stronger, but so will the forces of light. And we're going to talk about those tonight. Now we're going to talk about the forces of light. We're going to talk about the many victories for the good guys, if you will. We're going to talk about the new story that actually is being written, the new system that will replace this broken, sad, broken, dysfunctional system. It's in Our Common Purpose report. It's in the Partnership for American Democracy. It's in the many new networks that didn't exist just a few years ago, the Bridge Alliance, the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers, so many that American Promise is very proud to work with. And we are winning. Americans are going from the broken system to the work to build a new one. So you can look at the wins we've had. American Promise working on nothing less than a constitutional amendment, the For Our Freedom Amendment. It will give voice, representation, and freedom to all Americans. It'll stop the out-of-control corruption of money in our political system that locks so much into this broken place. 22 states have already called for this amendment, growing support in Congress. In Maine, 35,000 signatures on one day, with hundreds of volunteers out gathering signatures to do what Alaska did just in 2020, put on the ballot this question of this constitutional amendment. Maine did ranked choice voting. Maine just won open primaries just a couple of weeks ago. Alaska did that in the ballot initiative of 2020. All of those things. We saw those Republicans who defended the election results in Georgia reelected in a landslide last night after primaries seeking to punish them for doing their constitutional duty. 167 communities in Wisconsin formally calling for the constitutional amendment that American Promise is advancing. Ranked choice voting winning across the country. And then the civic work that you're going to hear more about tonight. There is great work being done. Tonight, we're going to talk about it, but more importantly, we're going to connect with each other and find out, if we're not already in the game, how we get in the game to take on the forces of darkness. So let's dive right in. I want to start with Danielle Allen to the conversation. She is, as Dr. Jessica mentioned, co-chaired the Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship out of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. That academy started by John Adams and some of the founders even before the Constitution was written, because they said the public, the people, will need information, knowledge, and practices that enable the people to govern ourselves. And the academy has been helping to advance that work for 200 and almost 50 years now. And so Danielle Allen did that great work with them. She's the James Bryant Conant University professor at Harvard University, has directed the Safra Center of Ethics there. She's a published author in so many great works. Our declaration on the Declaration of the Independence is a remarkable recent one that I'd recommend. A political theorist who's published broadly in democratic theory, political sociology, the history of political thought, but she's not just a theorist, she's a practitioner. In addition to Our Common Purpose Commission work, she's just come off a campaign for governor of Massachusetts, a citizen leader in the best sense of the word, combining deep learning and servant leadership and the practice of citizenship in a republic. Danielle, thank you for being with us. Will you tell us more about the commission that came out of the Academy? I call it the Our Common Purpose Commission. I hope that's okay with you. If not, Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship.
That's exactly, no, Our Common Purpose Commission is definitely the better name for it. Thank you so much, Jeff, for that generous introduction. And you are a model citizen leader, servant leader yourself. So thank you for the extraordinary example you set for all of us. And thank you to you and Dr. Jessica for acknowledging what a dark moment this is. We all feel it, the sort of awful combination of pain and anger and just deep, deep frustration. And I believe at the end of the day, that feeling that we have directly reflects that we know we're a better people than this, and that we can't believe we can't get our house in order. Those two things together. And we know we are a better people. I like to point to state ballot propositions. Often when we think about our national politics, we see all of the division, the constant conflicts, the way in which we're at each other's throats. But if you change the focus just a little, look at states, you can see really extraordinary occasions of the work we do together. I'm thinking of the ballot proposition in Mississippi in 2020 that introduced a new state flag, got rid of the old emblems of the Confederacy, replaced them with forward-facing symbols. This was more than 70% of the people of Mississippi voted for this, a supermajority vote. And I'm thinking of Florida, where again, a supermajority, more than 2/3 of the voters, so Republicans as well as Democrats, voted on a state ballot proposition to restore the right to vote to people who had completed their felony convictions. And I'm thinking about Massachusetts, my favorite state, of course, where a supermajority, 75% of us voted in the right to repair ballot proposition to ensure that small car manufacturers could have access to the data in cars and thereby stand their own against the big auto manufacturers. So that picture of what we do at the states is a sort of picture of an American people with a sort of strong moral compass, a strong sense of a commitment to inclusion and fairness. And yet our politics delivers inaction on guns and money in politics and provides the festering context in which a tragedy like the events in Texas yesterday occurs. So for me, in a deep way, to Jeff's point about just telling it like it is, this is a moment for digging deep and being really clear about who we are as a people and what we deserve as a people. We deserve a politics that can establish a foundation for healthy communities and for people to live healthy lives, do the work they need to do in their communities, and grow up with a sense of safety and security. It's just that basic. It's back to the Declaration of Independence. We establish these institutions to affect our safety and happiness. That's the phrase from the Declaration of Independence. And when they're failing to do that, it's our job, in the words of the Declaration, to alter them, to achieve an alteration, lay a foundation for that alteration on a matter of principles, some principles, and to figure out how to reorganize the powers of government. And that's what we're really talking about here tonight, that work of reorganization. So there are wins. Jeff pointed to a number of them, and I've just mentioned some of those state ballot propositions. And these wins align with the work of and the recommendations of the Our Common Purpose report from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. This was a commission process that ran for several years. It brought together a diverse group of people, demographically diverse, from different professional sectors, from across the country and from across the ideological spectrum. We came together because we all already had a red alert sense of where we are in this country in terms of the health of our politics. And we ran listening sessions all over the country, trying to figure out what do people think we can do to get ourselves out of the mess that we're in. And one gentleman at a listening session in Maine said, look, we're stuck in this vicious cycle. Our institutions don't deliver for us, and that increases our distrust of them. And then we distrust them, and so we withdraw from participation. And the less that we participate, then the less effective they are anyway. And so we're just sort of in a downward spiral. He said, isn't the point of democracy that we're supposed to have a virtuous circle where we have institutions that deliver for us and we participate in them knowing that they will deliver, and our participation sustains them, and we have a civic culture that sustains our participation and where we can strengthen and keep healthy our bonds with one another. We came on the commission to think of our job as being to try to kick us from that vicious cycle to that virtuous cycle. We focused on 31 reforms to do this, a set that were about reforming political institutions, a set that are about delivering a healthy civic ecosystem, the question of what's happening with social media, with information, but also can we build bridges across contexts and have strong bridge building organizations? And then there was a set of recommendations around civic learning. The recommendations are moving forward. Ranked choice voting is one of the recommendations. And as you heard, we've got that in Maine now, we've got that in New York City, we've got that in Alaska. Civic education, rebuilding investments in that was a recommendation. That's moving forward. There was a roadmap released a year after the Our Common Purpose report called Educating for American Democracy, about rebuilding excellence in history and civic learning for all learners K through 12 that came out March 2021. And there's a bill, bipartisan bill, making its way through Congress to invest in civics education. The roadmap was the work of 300 educators and scholars from across the country. So the point is just that this is an existential moment for us. There are things we can do. People are doing them. There are champions all over the country linking arms and getting the work done together. And in Our Common Purpose report, as we focused on these reforms, we, at the end of the day, identified one that we thought of was such supreme importance that it should be approached via a constitutional amendment. This is the amendment to end the impact of Citizens United, to restore sanity to the place of money in politics. It is the amendment that American Promise is working on. So we desperately need that amendment. Think about the gun rights lobby and the NRA and what their money in politics does. It is time for us, past time, we all know this, just long past time for us to make the change that's necessary. And that does mean all of us on the ground, linking arms, forming a movement to drive change in our states, signing petitions, getting ballot propositions done in order to get this to add up to change at the federal level. So thank you so much, Jeff, for this important conversation.
Thank you, Danielle. Really appreciate that. And I want to just ask my team to put the American Promise Citizen Pledge into the chat if you want to know more and are ready to join the call that Danielle Allen just gave to take seriously constitutional change, because we are at the level where only that kind of structural reform is going to get the job done. Sign the pledge. You'll get involved in your state, and if you want to, or just signing the pledge, of course, unites Americans to do it. It's massive support across the board. Like most of these reforms, the ranked choice voting, open primaries, the voters are way ahead of where the politicians are, and we can mobilize the voters. Also check out the other partners and recommendations on the Our Common Purpose website that's in the chat. And there's so many ways to get involved if you want to move and support any of these groups. This is about sort of the sadness and anger we feel today. It's about the education we're going to get from these great folks, but it's also about action. And there's no shortage of action that we'll be able to do. Also, of course, if you have questions, put them in the chat. They'll come to my attention, and I'll make sure I get them to our wonderful speakers. Danielle, stand by. We're going to come back to, I want to bring Diane to the conversation. Our Common Purpose Commission, 2 years in, now joined by a powerful Force, the Partnership for American Democracy. Diane Aviv is the CEO of the partnership. She has spent most of her professional life in leadership roles, collaborating with partners to improve lives of individuals, families, communities, and the nation. She has served as CEO of Feeding America, the largest hunger relief organization in the U.S., president and CEO of Independent Sector, a forum of local, national, global foundations, nonprofits, corporations, and individuals working to improve the world. She's been vice president of public policy, head of the Washington Action Office for the Jewish Federations of North America, and much more. I do want to note in our conversation with Dr. Jessica, you heard at the front end, say about her social work and how that has informed her work at American Promise for transformative national work. Diane Aviv started as a social worker in the land in which she was born in South Africa. So Diana, thank you so much for joining us and being the second example of powerful social workers changing and saving the world right now on this call. How are you?
Well, Jeff, it's just such an honor to be here, to be with you. I must say, to be following Danielle is terrifying and delightful at the same time. I find myself preferring to listen to her rather than anything else. So Danielle, just thank you for everything that you've done. And Diane, I'm very much looking forward to what you're going to talk about. You're right to have begun this with the this terrible incident that happened yesterday. And the worst part of it is that it's one of many, that it keeps happening. And so that, it's symbolic and symptomatic of a much deeper problem that we have. And I think that that we can't but ignore that. But at the same time, we also have to focus on what's happening to our democracy because we're at such risk. I'm just thrilled to be here. And I know, Jeff, you had wanted me to talk a little bit about the partnership itself. And it was created almost a year ago, just before July 4th, we launched. And our goal was to bring more energy and resources to the field and to help move the goals of the superb people, of whom there are many, who are working in the field of democratic renewal, protecting our democracy, increasing the integrity of the elections, but also working in a much broader space. And so the partnership was formed to bring together the coalition of leaders who work in 5 different areas of democratic renewal and to identify sustainable democracy goals that would be able to be achieved or substantially achieved by 2026, the 250th anniversary of our founding. And so that is, as you know, Jeff, you are one of those leaders in one of our pillars. We have 5 pillars that I'll just describe to you. I'll describe the work that we're doing, which is universal civic learning, expanded service to the nation, increasing social trust, election protection and effective governance, and accurate news and information. And we have been inspired by the work that has been done through our common purpose, supported by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And we have now moved towards a new initiative that is that the capstone of our work, which is more perfect. Jeff, I don't know if you wanted to ask me about that or if you want me to move into talking about that.
Let me unmute you first and then ask you about it. Thanks, Diana. I do appreciate that. I was out at Dallas, where American Promise is very glad to be a partner in the Partnership for American Democracy, and of course a recommendation and organization recognized by the Our Common Purpose Commission. We deeply believe in the not only our own work but the necessity of all of this work together, and it was quite exciting to be in Dallas at the George Bush Library, the President Bush Center, and several announcements were made about initiatives, because again, the forces of light are gathering and there are initiatives and victories. And one of the ones announced was the combating foreign influence in U.S. elections. an initiative of state ballot initiatives and work in Congress to close gaping holes where foreign adversaries are able to spend money, as well as billionaires and corporations. We now have foreign governments spending money influencing state and federal elections. That's in the American Promise Ballot Initiative in Maine, Protect Maine Elections. You can put a link in there in the chat if you would, team, and you can see, read that ballot initiative, but there's other state work going on around that, and work with a very good bipartisan bill in Congress to actually close the loophole that the FEC determined it had zero ability to stop foreign governments spending money and foreign government-owned corporations spending money to influence state elections. So that was we were excited to be part, but it turns out we, of course, were only one of many initiatives announced. So Diana, what were some of the others?
Jeff, just before I get into that, let me talk just a little bit about the More Perfect initiative, because the one in Dallas was the first, and there will be a number more, several more that are going to happen over the next couple of years. In concert with the presidential centers, there are 9: the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Karsh Institute for Democracy at the University of Virginia, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and more than 100 nonprofits and community organizations. The Partnership for American Democracy has launched More Perfect. That's what we're calling it, More Perfect, a national program aimed at marshaling the nation's energy towards strengthening and sustaining our democratic processes, our institutions, and our culture. Through 5 sustainable democracy goals, I described those areas before, leaders and institutions are working across diverse identities and divergent perspectives, and are stepping up to drive ambitious and measurable progress by 2026. And the particular program that we talked about, we started with the Bush Center. We felt that that was extremely important, and the program served as a rallying cry for election integrity and participation. We heard from a number of leaders. For example, historian John Meacham commented that our democratic elections can only endure in a moral covenant in which we see each other not as enemies, but as neighbors. And he also had compelling remarks about the importance of what he called constitutional character. Former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice mentioned in her comments that elections don't equal democracy, but without elections, you can't have a democracy. And she also noted that America is an idea. We're not unified by an ethnicity or nationality or religion. We're unified by an idea, and we have to keep up that fight. And I think, Jeff, that's what you've been alluding to. President Bush also delivered keynote remarks. And in his remarks, he said the truth of the matter is, in his view, that our system works pretty well. We have a large, complicated country, he said, with a variety of interests and states, and yet we've been pulling off elections for a while. And so on May 18th, we had this event, and then there were a series of recommendations that were put forward. Jeff, I won't go through all of them because it will take too long, but let me just give you a flavor of some of them. One is the Community Election Protection Program, which is an innovative program that focuses on 5 key battleground states. And the purpose is to empower local leaders in vulnerable jurisdictions with nonpartisan technical support and resources necessary to protect the integrity of the elections. Another one was announced by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is increasing support for its America Amplified Journalism Initiative, so that public television and radio stations in 26 states, including battleground states, will have the resources and editorial guidance that they need to develop frequently asked questions about the elections and voting for the 2022 midterm elections. And then they plan to do that in all 50 states for the 2024 elections. I'll just give you one more example, because there are, I've got 10 or 15. Civic Nation will recruit 5,000 attorneys to volunteer their time this year to ensure trusted elections in 2022. And through this, the nonpartisan community platform connecting community-based organizations with and NGOs with pro bono lawyers. And there are a number of others. Now you can hear that all of these recommendations focused on election protection. The next initiative that we will hold will be with the Reagan Presidential Center. It will be September 9th, and it will focus on civic learning, civic education throughout life. And so it will be with a different group of players and partners of the Partnership for American Democracy, and then we will move forward with the other presidential centers as well.
Great, thank you, Diane. I really appreciate that, and apologize for the feedback. If I will mute again if that is an issue. Just let me know. But really appreciate that, and I want to. There's a question or two in the chat around. You're hearing a lot of Republicans like President Bush and the Reagan Center, Democrats, independents, of course. This is a cross-partisan movement, and it is a movement that will be transformative. When these succeed, they are common purpose recommendations, as they will, and the Partnership for American Democracy reforms and civic practices, as they will. This country will be a different and profoundly better ways, and it's happening. So I want to bring in Diane Hessan because I think there can be a misperception that this all must be a bunch of centrist stuff or old-fashioned bipartisan, and that's long gone. It's not what's going on here. What's going on is Americans finding each other and saying, I don't care what your party is. If you're working for this kind of reform, if you're working to save the country, I want to stand with you and get it done. We can argue later about other stuff, but we're finding common ground. And that doesn't mean centrist. It could be, if that's the right answer, it could be centrist. It could help centrist reforms, but it could also be, what conservatives value or what progressives and liberals value. And to succeed, we have to understand what's really going on and where we do have common ground, because part of the forces of darkness, to continue my theme, is to make us feel divided and hatred against, quote, the other side. And there's billions of dollars in elections that are mostly spent on tearing us apart with attacks and demonization. And so I want to bring Diane Hessan in, because Diane has spent most of her career in business building a very strong company that I believe you're still the chair of, Diane, and but got a call in 2016 to take some of the skills that had enabled her to build such a successful business in understanding how people were thinking and what their attitudes were, to help understand what were the voters thinking. And that was in 2016. Diane stayed with it, those voters, and got a deep understanding. What are the Trump voters? What are the Clinton voters, the Biden voters? What are Americans really thinking? And she found some surprising results of what we really have in common and the opportunities there. So Diane, thank you so much. Please join us. Tell us about that project, about that book, and what you mean when you say our common ground. And then give us a bit of an intro. And then I want to ask you particularly about the gun violence that is tearing apart the country right now. But first, tell us about the project and how it came to be and what the book's about.
Okay, happy to do it. Good evening, everyone. And as Diana said, it's terrifying and delightful to be with such an esteemed group. So let me give you a little context. The most of my life I've spent as a market researcher in the business area, but in 2016, I started a project that was focused on understanding Americans as voters. I created a group of 500 voters from every state, every age and ethnicity, and the panel had people from all points along the political spectrum. And in essence, I was in conversation and did projects with this group every single week for 4.5 years. And whenever I learned something interesting, I wrote about it in a column for the Boston Globe, and then ultimately turned it into this new book called Our Common Ground. So I'm not a policy person, but I've got 7 million pieces of data about voters and what's going on with them. And the reason I called the book Our Common Ground is that when it comes to policy, there is generally much more common ground than you would think in the US. I mean, if you ask voters about the issues, about immigration, gun control, healthcare, climate change, and so on, you can get 80% of Americans to be willing to compromise on a particular solution. And so what I've tried to do is to basically unpack that and to talk about where we essentially agree with each other or where we're willing to compromise. And of course, the problem is that no one realizes this. I mean, Americans are tired right now from the daily grind. They're burnt out from COVID, and they have what I call outrage fatigue. You know, they're very worried about their pocketbooks. 78% of American full-time workers say they live paycheck to paycheck. 71% are in debt, and over half of those in debt say they're in over their heads. And on top of that, most Americans, whether they are Democrats or Republicans, believe that the other side has gone completely off the deep end. So for instance, if you ask most Republicans about the Democratic Party, they will say, Democrats are a bunch of elitist socialists who want to take away my hard-earned tax dollars and give them away to criminals and illegal immigrants and people who are too lazy to work. And they want to take away guns and allow women to use abortions as birth control. They want to completely dismantle policing and any current concept that we have of gender. Or if you ask most Democrats about Republicans, and especially those who voted for Trump, they will say, these are a bunch of hypocritical, uneducated deplorables who sleep with their guns and refuse to wear masks and deny that climate change is happening and never met a Black person they like. And both of these narratives are wrong. That's not who is populating those groups, but these stereotypes have been on the ballot in our country. They were last November. They dominate what we hear from the media. And as a result, despite the fact that they're inaccurate, they become our perspectives and they simmer underneath the surface of all of our divisiveness.
We've certainly seen it, Diane, what you're talking about in our American Promise work. American Promise, I see it, and there's a comment in the chat about, we should be talking with not just NPR listeners. And I want to emphasize American Promise has conservatives, has liberals, has independents, has people from all walks of life at every level, staff, board, and across the country in our volunteers. And I want to turn to the subject on our minds so much. After Maine saw a $200 million election for a Senate race, $200 million in the Susan Collins race, we had a campaign called Stand with Maine, which brought Mainers together, saying we are done with this outside money. We want our state back, our communities back. We want to be able to hear each other and talk with each other. We've lost that with the kind of thing you're talking about, Diane. And one of the leaders who joined us in that was David Trahan. He's a Republican. He's a logger. He's was a state senator who now runs the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, which is the strongest Second Amendment hunting and fishing group in Maine. Very much on board with American Promise. At the same time, one of our leaders in Congress, Ted Deutsch from Florida, introduced the amendment, brought with him to our National Citizen Leadership Conference a few years ago, the high school students from Parkland who survived that terrible shooting there, which sadly was one of so many that we've now seen of school shootings with nothing being done. But the students spoke at our conference. So we literally have the victims of this terrible scourge and Second Amendment advocates. And so I want to ask you, Diane, what are the David Trahans, the conservative voters, the Trump voters, the gun owners thinking tonight? What are the voters thinking tonight? Where is the common ground tonight after what happened in Texas yesterday?
Yeah. So let me start with just the foundation, which is a bit of what I talked about before, our inaccurate perceptions, the other side. So think about the narrative in our heads. The narrative in our heads is that the right wants to walk down Main Street carrying their favorite gun, go home to a basement full of hundreds of guns and an unlocked cabinet. And Their perception of the other side is that the liberals want to take away all guns, abolish them from our country. And again, these are what people are talking about on the fringes. So in my gun control chapter, I actually start with a story. I tried to tell a lot of stories here because I think it's so compelling to hear the voices of voters. So I start with a story of a man named Jim, who is from Arizona. He's an older man and he's a Republican. And he's a card-carrying member of the NRA. And he told me about he got his first gun from his grandfather, a .22 caliber rifle at age 7. So in 2017, after the horrible mass shooting at the music festival in Las Vegas, where 60 people were killed, I actually called Jim to find out what he thought, because he kept talking about the NRA, and yet he was very reasonable in a lot of other areas. And of course, the first thing Jim said to me was, remember, Diane, 99.9% of gun owners are not crazies, which of course was predictable. But then he surprised me. So he said, by the way, I really believe we need reform. We need to get rid of bump stocks. We need to get rid of the gun show loophole. We need to make sure people on the terrorist watch list don't get the right to own a gun. We need to implement a mandatory waiting period for gun purchases. I mean, he went on, and a lot of what he said, again, is supported by about 80% of Americans. Now, look, some of how you feel about guns depends on where you live. So if you've never lived in gun country, you probably want significantly more gun control. You can't figure out why we need 300 million guns in the US. But what people in gun country tell me is you might want to close the gun show loophole, but guess what? You've never been to a gun show. You know, you want to ban automatic weapons, but you don't really know the difference between automatic and semi-automatic. You know, if you live in gun country, you might live in rural America in a house that's in the middle of nowhere, and you feel fear from time to time. So a gun is like having a security system. But my voters who are gun owners talk about this Zen quality they feel from shooting a gun. You know, they talk about a perfect shot in the way I might talk about hitting a really great drive off the tee. And one of my voters, who's a woman named Linda from South Carolina, told me she was raised in Massachusetts. She never had any interest in guns because it was just not a thing here where I live. But she moved down south and she got into guns, and she owns a few. She even has given guns as gifts. And she talks about gun culture that is one that is very heavy on civility and responsibility. So if Linda gets a call telling her a vote for a Democrat is a vote to take away her guns, guess what she'll do? You know, and there is so much common ground, but the bills don't pass, and they don't pass partially because of all the funding. I've seen many examples of this in the chat tonight. The other is that our elected leaders are better off with no resolution. It's just easier to be a Republican and scream and yell that the liberals want to take your guns away and that if you elect me, I will stop them, or to be a Democrat and make the case for gun control now and so on. The act of resolving the issue takes the talking points away. So, we are left with a system in which we just can't count on our elected leaders to get us out of the divisiveness, but there's enormous common ground on gun control.
Fascinating. Thank you, Diane. I want to open it up and bring all of our speakers into the conversation. First, acknowledging Kurt's comment in the question in the chat, and a clarification, taking me to task, which is what this is all about in a democracy, about maybe forces of light versus darkness may be divisive. An assumption in that, I think that he says the secular left might be to blame more than the churchgoers. I won't say where I spend my Sunday mornings, but it's not what I mean. I mean the forces of darkness in all of us, and that we are all called to contend in that issue right now. That this is not about pointing fingers and blame. And I'm trying to say we are called to what I think humans always are, an epic struggle of light against darkness in ourselves. And that's what I mean by the new story. So I certainly don't intend to divide or accuse anyone of being the dark force, let alone not have the humility to claim I'm the light force. I think what we're wrestling with is America going to be able to, just like individually we try to conquer our demons and be the promise that we can be and that we are. And that's where the effort on the light side is for me. So that's just my personal clarification. I appreciate the comment and the question, Kurt. Let me get back to Danielle, because she's heard a little bit of what's been said. The common ground that Diane just talked about, and Diane, if you would jump in too, I'd love to hear. You all have been around the country. You're talking to a lot of people. Danielle, you ran for governor, and you and I both know Massachusetts is not as liberal as sometimes people think, and different parts of the state are different. You've been all over the state. Do you see that common ground? Do you have the conversations with people that give you hope that we can conquer and do some of this big stuff that you've brought to the table tonight?
100%. I mean, I keep saying to people, I may have said this to you already, Jeff, that running for office was a very expensive, but to the point of the conversation here, very expensive, but very effective form of therapy, in fact. So I certainly started my effort from a position of a great sense of sort of anger and despair about where we were. It was December 2020. We were watching incredible dysfunction here in our state. Our schools, kids weren't back in school yet, and we were getting unstable, uncertain guidance from state government. And then there was the real conflict between state governments and federal governments, and of course, then much exacerbated by the election. So, I was definitely in a bad mood when I decided to jump into this effort. And it was a really hope-bringing experience. For starters, although there were many specific and tangible ways in which we could point to our governments, whether state or federal, letting us down, we weren't letting each other down. And that was just really playing over and over again. You think about the vaccine rollout, which we really struggled with here in Massachusetts, and local civic organizations really turned the tide. The Black Boston COVID Coalition, for example, in the city that got vaccines into people's arms with get out the vote techniques, and the Berkshire County COVID Collaborative that did the same, but even other issues as well. Take policing. I just was really blown away by work in Lynn, where an effective mayor helped forge an alliance between social justice activists and organizations and the police, so that they were able to build a pilot program with city funds for unarmed emergency response services. It's a beautiful example of finding that common ground across a line that supposedly, we're not able to bridge. So yes, it was a hope-bringing experience. And I just agree 100% with what Diane said, that there is a lot of common ground among us, as we sort of try to solve problems in our communities. But our politics doesn't realize that. It doesn't cash it out, make good on it for us. And so for me, the real question is what's the source of the disconnect? It's impossible not to come back to money and politics and the way that drives that disconnect between what we want and how our politics plays out. For me, it's also, impossible to avoid coming back to the plurality electoral method and the fact that it lets people win an election with just a teeny tiny section of the electorate, especially in primaries. So there are all these things I really do think we have to work on. And then I guess I wanted to also ask a kind of question about our civic culture. Because at the same time that I do see lots of common ground, I also, personally sort of feel like, historically speaking, I've seen changes that I wonder about and have questions about. So for example, Diane, coming back to gun culture for a moment, I totally recognize the difference that you're describing. And I know the moment when I was like, okay, I got to figure out the difference between an automatic rifle semi and like hunting gear versus military gear, and started diving down the rabbit hole of trying to understand this, and definitely found myself in a place where I could see kind of connoisseurship working, people caring about the fine differences between these things and certain kinds of pleasures taken from the activity. So I get that. And I see the difference in cultures. But I don't think the kind of gun culture we have now actually existed in the 80s. And I think that's my experience. And that's a question that I'm putting to you. Like, has there been a historical change in this, a sort of growth in the sort of spread of gun culture and social affiliations, or would you consider it historically stable? And if it has changed, then that brings us back to the NRA and the role of money in politics and things like that. But
Jeff, if I might add a little here, in some ways I'm going to defend your point that you made earlier about the forces of this and that, in saying it maybe in a different way. There are lots and lots and lots of organizations and individuals who are concerned about what's happening in our society and are doing things about it and have joined together to do that. It's also true that we have in our society now a group of people who don't trust the elections, who don't believe that the last elections were fairly won, and are taking actions and steps to try and undermine what will happen in 2022 and particularly in 2024. Steve Bannon of Donald Trump fame has made clear that his goal is to disorient people. Straight after the elections, 40% of the public thought that the elections were not fair, and now it's 56%. That doesn't seem to me to be progress. You could say that if all of the multiple efforts of everybody combined didn't happen, it would be much worse than that, and we would be in more dire straits, and we aren't. But nevertheless, I think that there's lots of work to do, and the people around this table this evening are certainly people who care about this and want things to be done. And at the same time, we should celebrate the successes and be grateful that people are coming together. One of the areas that I feel very optimistic about is that there are whole sectors in our society whose mission and purpose is something other than focusing on democracy, who are worried about democracy and want to lean in, and certainly have approached the partnership, and we've reached out to them and they've been responsive. And I think that's helpful, because in the end, it's going to be everybody standing together. It's not just going to be R's and D's. It's going to be the business community, the faith community, higher education, young people. There are a whole range of sectors and the way in which you can slice and dice it, where it matters that they are part of the solution. Last point I'd make, I spent a lot of my professional life engaging in advocacy. And Danielle, had you become governor, which I wish you had, I would have spent time in my earlier years lobbying you in that regard. And I'm sure that most of the time we would have agreed. But that said, I worked at a time when Republicans and Democrats understood the difference between the public rhetoric and then getting together at the end of the day and trying to find solutions in which there were compromises. Now that kind of common ground we find on the ground in local communities, the way that Diane has described, but the political class are no longer leaders to our society. That's a big change.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think our political leaders are going to get us out of this. I mean, look, the difference between now and 30 years ago, just with your question, Danielle, for instance, is the media and the airtime and the internet time that the fringes get, which again affects our perception of what's really happening in the mainstream. I mean, I would estimate that over 70% of Americans right now would characterize themselves as moderates. And in the 4.5 years I was talking to voters, the biggest shift during the Trump presidency was not someone going from Republican to Democrat or Democrat to Republican. The biggest shift was the movement of voters towards the center. More of my voters changed their political party to characterizing themselves as independents, mostly because they were just fed up with their respective political parties. And they think they're a small group. But this is actually, and I haven't done the quantitative analysis for the past couple of months, but I would say that it's over 75% of the country is just absolutely fed up. And I think people also aren't heard. I mean, if you really dig deep, I have a whole chapter on this, but if you really dig deep and you talk to people about voter fraud, there are a lot of interesting issues underneath that. A lot of the people who talk about fraud are not saying Trump is our actual president and Biden is illegitimate. They're saying things like they've got enormous concerns about mail-in voting, especially mail-in voting when you don't have to demonstrate that you are actually the person whose name is on the ballot. most people under the age of 35 think that there's huge potential for fraud in voting because they don't understand why in an internet age, when we have the blockchain for security, they have to sit with a little black pencil and fill in a hole. I mean, you can go on and on. Many people have experienced the potential for fraud. They've gotten their children's ballots at home, even though their children moved away to another state 10 years ago or whatever else. And I think generally they feel that when the Democrats complain about something like Russians interfering with the election, we spend $35 million. We have a federal commission. We really study it, but nothing is ever done for them. So beneath what we hear about on the surface are some things that I would characterize as issues that are really worth understanding and addressing. And we're going to need to do that by having conversations with each other, because I totally agree with what Diana said. We're not going to be able to depend on our political leaders for that.
Thank you. We're running down on time. I want to make sure we get some final words from all three of you. I want to ask the team to put in the chat a couple of things. And one, of course, is the American Promise sign up again. If you haven't already, please do. We're going to continue this conversation and continue this work together. The bridging comment, thank you for that. Braver Angels, American Promise, Bridge USA, Bridge Alliance. What you were hearing over and over from these speakers and others is that we have misimpressions about a lot of misimpressions, and billions of dollars go into reinforcing those misimpressions because there's political tactics and advantage to keep it that way, to actually talk with each other, to bridge across and find out where that common ground is a radical act these days that can lead to transformation. So thank you for that. So sign up at American Promise. We're going to have some volunteer training. If you haven't already been out talking, bridging with your clipboards and talking in your states with your fellow citizens, regardless of what party they may be part of, to get involved, sign up for one of the trainings, and you'll see a link in the chat to do that. Look, we only have about 40 seconds each for you to say any final remarks, maybe what gives you hope, what you recommend for folks on the call to do, whatever you want to say. Let me go with Diana first, then Danielle, and then Diane. Diana?
Well, Jeff, thanks for doing this and bringing everybody together. That's in fact part of what the solution is, as solving these problems together. I'm very excited about the More Perfect initiative that the Partnership for American Democracy is doing, because it's bringing together people from across demographies, across ideological differences, and trying to solve problems together and highlighting the successful efforts that people are making. The only way we'll succeed is if you get all of your friends to come, and everybody that you know, to be part of these kinds of efforts, both with Jeff and with all of us, so that it becomes America concerned about democracy and America solving this together.
Great. Thank you. Danielle, actually stand by. We opened with you. I want to close with you and go to Diane first. Diane?
What do I say? I mean, I agree with what you've been saying about American Promise. I mean, the mission is so compelling. You know, let's overturn Citizens United. Let's limit the amount of money that can be spent to influence elections. You know, I'm not on the staff or the board, but if anybody in this Zoom event gives $100 or more to American Promise in the next week, I will send you a free autographed copy of my book. Look, after analyzing all of this data, the most important thing I've learned is that sometimes in the heat of the moment, we forget that we are all fellow Americans, and that most of us are trying to get by and do our best, and that almost all are worthy of our respect and compassion. And walking in each other's shoes is just a critical first step that can truly change the trajectory of our country in the 21st century.
Wow, well, that's fantastic. Diane, thank you. Let's get a link in the chat to the American Promise donate page.
That's right, donate.
And you can get a book, a signed book from Diane, our Common Ground, if you donate $100. Donate anything if you want, but to get the book signed by Diane. That's such a generous offer. Thank you so much. We appreciate that. Let me go to Danielle and close it out. And by the way, of course, you can get the book anywhere, and you should, for less than $100. So that's a special offer, and we appreciate that. But if you don't have $100, get the book anyway, and we encourage that as well. So, but really appreciate the support. Danielle, closing call to action, remarks, anything that you want to close us out with?
Well, I'm just so grateful to be here. I feel like we're a new band. It's like the 3 Ds for democracy here. We could take it on the road and keep having this conversation. Diane, it's just been such a pleasure. I've learned so much from listening to both of you. And Jeff, your constant focus. I mean, again, I started by saying you're a model citizen servant, and you truly are. Your constant focus and your constant calling of us all to our civic responsibilities. So there is a pledge to sign. There is work to do to move a ballot proposition forward in particular states in support of moving a constitutional amendment forward. There hasn't been a constitutional amendment achieved in this country since the early 1990s, and that one was kind of like technicality amendment, so barely even counts. So we're overdue. We're overdue. It really is time. And it does take talking to neighbors, building the coalition. Everybody on this call should go find 5 people and spread the gospel, and the 3 Ds will make a recording and come 3 Ds for democracy, deliver a message to you.
Fantastic. The 3 Ds. I love it. Thank you, 3 Ds. Danielle Allen, Diane Hessan, Diana Aviv, the Partnership for American Democracy, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. We're so grateful to all of the great work, and to all of you on this call for never giving up on this country and on each other. And stay in touch. We'll continue the work, continue the conversation. Have a wonderful night, and take care.